Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So Emmert, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Can we start by sort of painting a picture of how you got to doing this research on alcohol dependence?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an addiction psychiatrist by background. So I qualified as a doctor about 10 or 11 years ago or so, and subsequently have specialised in psychiatry and then within psychiatry and addiction. So I look after patients with multiple drug and alcohol problems, but also problems with addictive behaviours such as gambling or gaming. And, you know, I would see in my clinic the sort of horrors that alcohol dependence and addiction to alcohol and other drugs can have. And as part of my work, I split my time between seeing patients and doing research. And so what I wanted to do was really understand how changes in our policy, in national policy and how in legislation had impacted on our patients in terms of their ability to access services and the sort of knock-on effects of that. So what kind of effects were the policy changes having on our patients, but also on our on our profession. So the number of addiction psychiatrists has drastically reduced since 2012 across the country, and the number of training posts in addiction psychiatry have gone down. And that's really what drove me to do some more research around drug and alcohol service provision and how that's impacted across the country.
So, I mean, just take it a little bit further back. What sort of drove what was the impetus to get you into psychiatry and sort of working with people in that sense?
So yeah, I qualified as a doctor back in 2010, and then everyone does 2 years of sort of foundation posts, so general medicine, general surgery, and I really liked psychiatry. I found mental illness interesting. The patients were, you could really help people. It's a much more holistic way of dealing with medicine. It's, you treat the whole person. You want to think about both the biological, all the biological, psychological and social aspects of illness. And psychiatry in particular is fascinating because it touches on all sorts of different aspects of society. So, social problems, political problems. There's a lot of legal implications in psychiatry with the Mental Health Act. And addiction sort of has all of that, but tenfold higher. So there's obviously a huge amount of policy problems when it comes to drugs and alcohol. There's a huge amounts of legal issues surrounding drugs and alcohol. It has a great amount of societal impact. And I find that it's the area of psychiatry where you can make the most amount of difference. We have very good evidence-based treatments that we can deliver to patients who are very grateful, and you can do some really good work and really reduce their distress and improve their lives. And there's not a huge amount of access to it. It's not a particularly sexy specialty, and psychiatry is often sort of stigmatized for a variety of reasons, and addiction is even stigmatized within psychiatry. So that's what drew me to it: the patients themselves, and the sort of legal policy, political whirlwind that goes around addiction.
I mean, and the findings that you've sort of produced in one of your papers is shocking, to be honest, because I mean 1 in 5 people has harmful use of alcohol. That's an enormous number of people in the UK.
Yeah, so that number, just to be clear, is only people in hospitals. So 1 in 5. So if we if you look in the general population, that's about if you look across the population when we do surveys, it's about 10 times higher than we look in the general population. However, like as you say, it's a huge number, and also when people are in hospital, it's a really golden opportunity to treat them, or to find out that they have a problem with alcohol. And there's a huge stigma around alcohol problems, even among doctors and nurses. And so when they are in hospital, if we're not screening for alcohol problems there, given that it can affect so many body systems and is often the reason that people are coming into hospital, it seems like we're missing an opportunity if we're not using hospitals where there's a pool of people with problems who we could be helping.
And that makes a lot of sense. But then one of the things that sort of comes to my mind is, how willing are these are people with these sort of dependencies and addictions? How forthcoming are they for addiction treatment?
Yeah, so not all of them are, but if you don't ask, you'll never know. So there's a huge hidden amount of burden within the UK. If we look at the sort of rates of people who are coming to community specialist alcohol treatment, the best service in the UK is only getting about 50% of the people who have alcohol problems through the door, and the worst service in the UK is getting 95% of people. Sorry, is getting 5% of people through the door. So they're terrible numbers, and we, if we look on an international basis, sort of, we're not doing particularly well in that. So even in the service that's doing the worst, we know we've got a huge amount of people who we can get into services. So yes, you're right. Not all people who have alcohol problems are willing to necessarily accept that or be motivated to change. But if you don't ask, and if you don't think that alcohol could be driving these problems, you're not going to change hearts and minds. You're not going to get people through the door, and you're not going to reduce the stigma of asking about alcohol to start with. So any kind of asking or screening in hospital is only going to highlight the problem, get the people who need it into specialist treatment, and start reducing the stigma that we need to.
I mean, I wonder, over the past sort of, let's say 5 or so years, and things have been relatively difficult economically for people, especially with the sort of government cuts and that sort of stuff. I wonder how much of that has contributed to more people becoming, addicted to alcohol. Is there any stats to suggest this?
Yeah, lots. So alcohol is you're much more likely to have an alcohol problem if you're from a more deprived socioeconomic area. And really interestingly, there's a thing called the alcohol harm paradox. So if you take sort of person A and person B who drink at exactly the same kind of amount, and one is from a higher socioeconomic area and one is from a lower socioeconomic area, even though they're drinking about the same, the person from the lower socioeconomic area has more alcohol related harm. So it's a paradox within
Why
that.
is that?
So it's a whole host of factors. So poverty is obviously can drive a lot of ill health, and both mental and physical health problems, and alcohol-related diseases are associated with common mental health problems as well. So you end up in a position, and I guess this is one of the reasons that I was saying I was drawn to addiction psychiatry, is that sorting out someone's alcohol problems, there's all sorts of loads of social problems that go alongside it. Often people have an increased risk of homelessness, and people have an increased risk of domestic violence, and all of the things that come with poverty and socioeconomic challenge. And one of the ways that you can get people into services or into treatment services can be through their substance misuse addiction. It can be the sort of end result of all of those adversities that they've had to face. And thus, treating their alcohol means that you can also start thinking about their benefits, their housing, their work, their life in general, really, and trying to, ease distress. It's treating their alcohol problem isn't just treating their alcohol problem. It's understanding the human in front of you and trying to make life better. That's the aim of being a doctor, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And but one of the things you mentioned earlier, and I want to sort of touch on it a bit more, is you said these addiction treatments aren't easily accessible. So can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so there are huge amounts of barriers to accessing specialist substance misuse services in England and internationally, but England is what I focus on. And I guess we divide them into sort of individual factors about people, and then factors about the services themselves, or system level factors. And obviously addiction is hugely stigmatizing. So picking up the phone or walking through the door of a service is very difficult for people to start with. But also, like, if we think about the sort of more structural things, like not knowing where the service is, the problem in the UK, as I've said, is that there's competition within the services, and so there's a big churn of the providers of services normally every 3 years. And so if the service is changing either location or contact details or the staff every 3 years, obviously it's very difficult for health services to keep up and know where to send people. And then there's all sorts of physical barriers. So maybe the building, they're commissioned by local authorities, so maybe the building is actually 40 miles away, and you've got to get 3 buses to get there. And that's going to be very difficult for someone who's dependent on alcohol, perhaps who's struggling to access money, but also who might have a slightly chaotic lifestyle and find it difficult to access there. And also services themselves can put up barriers. So often they will ask for ID, which is not a prerequisite in the UK. The guidelines make that very specific. And so certain groups can be more disenfranchised than others. So homeless people in particular, who are obviously more transient, can often find it difficult to access services. So there's a whole bunch of barriers, and we've done some work on this around the barriers of accessing specialist services. And they're very, very high, as emphasised by the numbers that I said earlier. Even the best service in the country is only getting 50% of the people who have an alcohol problem through the door. I'm so sorry, I just need to grab my charger. If that's all right. My battery's going to die. One second.
So, I mean, all these problems that you sort of point to with these services don't seem like they're big problems. They don't seem like they're problems that are difficult to solve.
So I think you're right. The difficulty is that we have 151 local authorities, all of whom have a different commissioning process, a different commissioner, a different treatment provider. I'm just talking about England at the moment. And so having sort of overarching understanding or guidance is really difficult when you've got decentralized services. And what the Health and Social Care Act did and made the argument for was that, local areas know their local population better than central government, and so they can adapt and tailor services to their local population, which is a solid argument. But what we've shown through our research is that actually the localism sort of agenda has really disenfranchised drug and alcohol people. Local authorities are really struggling for money. They've got a huge amounts, lots of demands on their services, and often drug and alcohol budgets are very are seen as easier to cut because our patients are not vote winners. They are hidden, marginalized members of society. Drug and alcohol budgets are often, the first thing that can easily be cut. And when you have that spread out over 151 different local authorities without sort of central oversight, it leads to the kind of situations that I'm talking about. So different services having barriers to different access in order to try and restrict the kind of people who are coming in. And also the problems with funding, so reduction in cuts in funding year on year.
So this approach to sort of, I guess, pass this responsibility onto local authorities. You say is sort of, if I'm not wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you mentioned that a certain percentage of it goes to sort of voluntary organizations and the charities and that sort of thing to intervene. How is the quality of their work being monitored?
So the way the system works at the moment is each local authority has the statutory responsibility to provide a drug and alcohol service, and they normally have 1 or 2 people within the local authority who act as the commissioner for that service. They'll put out a tendering bid, and then various organizations can bid to provide that service. In England at the moment, about 65% of services are provided by the voluntary sector, and about 35% of services are provided by the NHS. So each individual local authority monitors the sort of success of their individual service. So say I'm in, say I'm in York, and the York local authority commissions this particular organisation to provide their drug and alcohol services. So York will monitor how they're doing in terms of the number of people through their door, the number of people who are completing treatment, and then also Public Health England has a role nationally and regionally to monitor the sort of national level statistics of who's coming into treatment, are they getting better, what's happening. And it's that national picture that we've seen since 2012, year on year, the number of people in specialist alcohol treatment falling over the course of the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and that's really worrying. And we think that that's probably in relation to barriers that I mentioned earlier, but also
it's one of the things that is that I can't help but feel from everything that you're saying is the fact that the government's attitude towards this problem, which is clearly a significant problem because it's 20% of hospital admissions. The government's attitude seems to be very nonchalant with it. Like, it seems to be something that they just have to tick a box and let it happen.
Yeah, I think we also shouldn't underestimate the influence of the alcohol industry in all of this. So the alcohol industry is an incredibly powerful lobby, which has relationships with government and is big business. And the alcohol industry requires people to continually drink at high rates in order to maximize its shareholder profits. It has a huge history and of lobbying behind it, and akin to smoking and all other various substances that have negative public health effects. And so the government obviously has to balance the need for revenue to come in with the interests of business and also the health of the nation. And at the moment, I don't think that our current alcohol strategy is fit for purpose. There's been discussions quite a lot about future alcohol strategies being made. A lot of that has been delayed due to COVID, but in my mind, COVID is going to exacerbate the situation with alcohol and the pressure on services even more than perhaps it was without the pandemic.
I think just to add to that point, I'm just looking at some of these statistics online, and the size of the alcohol industry just in the UK alone is around £55 billion per year. Now that's a staggering number if it's just alcoholic drinks alone. Yeah. How much do you think challenging the alcohol industry in terms of policy would improve the rates of sort of these alcohol addictions?
A lot. So the World Health Organization, the WHO, has sort of done quite a lot of work on the best ways to sort of improve alcohol-related population health. And their three, what they call their best buys, so as in you spend the least amount of money to get the most bang for your buck in terms of policy interventions, are to reduce the affordability of alcohol, so raise the price, reduce the availability of alcohol, so reduce the density of alcohol outlets, and to restrict alcohol marketing. Now, all of those are obviously going to have impacts on the profits of the alcohol industry, because the overall amount of alcohol drunk in the population would go down, and hopefully the amount of alcohol harm would also go down. And so there is a tension between those three policy asks and the taxable revenue that comes in from the alcohol industry. And there are a number of policy sort of levers that the government can and could do. The main one that you might have heard about is what's called MUP, or minimum unit alcohol pricing, which is a policy that was brought in Scotland a year and a bit ago, and also has started in Wales this year. And the English part of the Westminster government has staunchly opposed it. It's a policy that was delayed for about 5 years because of legal challenges by the alcohol industry, led by the Scottish Whisky Association, that was ultimately overturned in the Supreme Court. And it's a very useful policy. It's already started to be shown to reduce alcohol-related hospital admissions and alcohol sales in Scotland, and the hope is that the death data, which follows a little bit behind it, will also improve. And and it basically sets a ceiling floor for alcohol prices. So it stops all of your, it's currently set at 50p. So per unit of alcohol, you have to charge a minimum of 50p. Doesn't really affect pubs because the price in pubs is already pretty high. So it protects the pub industry. But it stops things like buy one, get one free offers and weekend deals and things like that in supermarkets, which we know really drive a lot of alcohol harm.
So then, the alcohol industry alone is, there's lots of offshoots to it, sort of like the retail industry and their role and sort of how many, if you look at it on a sort of more local scale, how many off licenses there are and how many sort of shops that depend on the sale of alcohol. So then, does that make it too large a problem to try to challenge?
I don't think so. So the Licensing Act regulates the sort of density and the amount of off licenses and outlets that sell alcohol nationally. But again, it's implemented by local authorities. And so there is some leeway for local authorities in terms of what they are and aren't allowed to have. We know from the international evidence that the restriction in availability of alcohol improves alcohol-related health harm dramatically. I am not by any means or by any shape or stretch of the imagination a temperance advocate. Like I think society needs an intoxicant. I think alcohol should be legal, and we should continue to provide it. That doesn't mean that we can't have sensible policies that restrict alcohol harm, and reducing its availability is one of the best ways of doing that. So yeah, reducing the density of off-license outlets, stopping having a curfew or times that you stop selling it. And if you look at South Africa recently during the pandemic, they banned all sales of alcohol throughout the COVID pandemic, and it's had some positive impacts in terms of alcohol harm.
What happens to people addicted to alcohol when there's just they don't have access to it anymore?
So that's really dangerous. So unplanned alcohol withdrawal is life-threatening. Mm-hmm. So people can have seizures and also die from unplanned alcohol withdrawal. So that's why people who are dependent on alcohol, or we might use the word addicted, should never suddenly stop drinking. That's very, very dangerous, and so they should they should have medical supervision, so come to a specialist treatment service, and there might be ways to reduce their drinking safely with them, or it might be that they require a detox or detoxification. And that can either be done in hospitals or it can be done in the community with them, depending on a variety of factors. But yeah, people who are dependent on alcohol shouldn't stop drinking suddenly.
So suppose that, I'll give you a scenario. Suppose that now you were to be sat in front of senior members of the government who make these decisions. What kind of advice, as somebody who's been on the front lines, who's experienced this, who also knows on a systemic level how it looks, what kind of advice would you give the government, and what's your justification for it?
So I suppose when you're talking to government, you have to be very clear and you have to be very smart goal orientated on your asks, otherwise nothing gets done. Mm-hmm. And you also can't go with a long list of demands that are just going to fall on deaf ears. So I think at the moment, politically, there are two big things that the government could do relatively quickly and with relatively broad consensus across Parliament that would dramatically change alcohol-related harm in the UK, and they're both related to money. So I think that minimum unit pricing could be introduced in England very quickly, very sensibly, very easily. We have a template for it in Wales, we have a template for it in Ireland, we have a template for it in Scotland. So minimum unit pricing would have immediate positive benefits. The second thing that the government has committed to do, which I would push on, is a reform of alcohol duty, so the taxation processes that go around alcohol. And partly that's been driven by Brexit. So some of the our alcohol duty system is bizarre and is quite antiquated, and for some drinks, so for wine and spirits, it's based on the alcohol content, and for some drinks, so beer and cider, it's based on the volume. So my suggestion would be to tie taxation directly related to the percentage of alcohol within drinks. you have more tax, and it becomes more expensive for people to buy higher strength drinks, which will reduce, we think will reduce the overall amount that people are drinking, and therefore have positive health benefits on society. And I think that could be very easily done regulatory wise, and I think that they're the two things that are most likely to get through this Parliament currently. So they both involve sort of changes in financial structures around alcohol or taxation structures.
Is that not sort of inevitable anyway because of Brexit?
No. So the alcohol duty is complicated in terms of the way it's regulated. It could just be, there's a very, the path of least resistance would be to just keep the current system that we have and tick a box. But a proper formal review of the duty system, which takes into account alcohol harm, would probably result in a much different system than the one we have at the moment.
Are there any countries that we can sort of look to for sort of for lessons in dealing with alcohol?
Yeah, I mean, just look across the border. Scotland is sort of trailblazing the way with alcohol-related policy and investment in its alcohol services. So whereas England has disinvested quite substantially, so we've lost 250 million from our services since 2012. Scotland has increased funding to alcohol services across the board, and also, as I've mentioned, has introduced minimum unit alcohol pricing. Now, Scotland aren't getting all things right. They've just reported their highest number of drug-related deaths on record a couple of days ago. So their substance misuse strategy is not quote unquote good by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. They are doing certainly some good things in terms of alcohol policy. So they should be commended for that, whilst also being interrogated quite substantially about their drug related deaths.
So to me it sounds like it's a problem. I mean, let's just go back before 2010. I don't know if you've gone that far back in terms of your own research, but prior to the coalition government, how was the attitude towards addiction and addiction treatment with previous governments in the UK?
So, I mean, the relationship with alcohol and any government is often complicated due to the alcohol industry and the benefits of taxation that come in. As you say, it's a $55 billion industry, £55 billion industry in the UK, and so there is often a tension between business and government along those lines. That being said, when services were more under direct control of the NHS, things were better in some ways and worse in other ways. So there's been a lot more innovation that's happened because of the voluntary sector involvement. And if we look at sort of under the Labour government from Tony Blair, his main stance in the way alcohol and drug policy was crafted was often through the Home Office and through the lens of viewing crime. So it was often around trying to reduce criminal activity that was seen to be the result of drug and alcohol problems. So, and a lot of the money that was funneled towards drug and alcohol services was done so on a crime reduction sort of basis, and those were the outcomes that were being looked at. Now, that had again some positives, but to look at alcohol and drug use solely through the lens of crime is stigmatizing to patients that do it, and also neglects the fact that quite a lot of the patients who come through our door don't commit any crimes, particularly when it comes to alcohol. And so taking a more public health, more harm reduction approach from the government, as opposed to sort of viewing it through the Home Office and through the lens of policing, is likely to have greater impacts on alcohol-related harm than a merely crime-focused approach.
When it comes to sort of looking at the problem of addiction, are there any particular demographics or age groups that are at particular risk?
Yeah, so older people have more vulnerable brains, so they tend to have greater alcohol-related harm. And as you get older, you become more at risk of alcohol-related brain damage, which can lead to, is a risk factor for developing dementia, a variety of different dementias, but you can also have alcohol-specific dementias. So yeah, older people, definitely. Also, that reflects changing demographics. So, a lot of younger people are not drinking as much as perhaps other generations past, and are becoming, the proportion of younger people who are abstinent totally from alcohol is higher in current times than it has been previously. So yeah, older people definitely. As I've mentioned before, people from lower socioeconomic areas are disproportionately affected, both in terms of access to services, but also in terms of alcohol-related harm. And if we look at ethnicity, what's quite interesting is that white people in general seem to be experiencing more alcohol-related harm than individuals from Black or other ethnic minorities in the UK, if we look at the hospitalisation data in particular. And that's interesting of itself, because that's obviously not reflective of a lot of other physical and mental health problems in which BME individuals disproportionately are affected. So it's unusual in terms of addiction, and we think it's if we break out, because white people obviously aren't a homogeneous group in and of themselves. If you look into sort of white British, white Irish, and Eastern European populations, the same thing holds for all three of those. So there does seem to be something going on with that. I don't think the data on that is particularly good at the moment. It's what we're trying to do some work on at the moment and understand a bit more. But it's one of it's unusual in terms of its in terms of the split of white and non-white.
So we've sort of discussed briefly the attitude towards alcohol through a health sort of angle. We've discussed briefly the attitude through a crime angle. What about the role of education? Has education or educating young kids, making it compulsory to really drive home the problems of addiction, would that play a factor, or is that of importance?
So it is important. However, if we look at the sort of, again, the best buys that I was talking about from the WHO, the World Health Organization, alcohol-related education actually scores really, really low in terms of bang for your buck. So if you're gonna put energy, investment, money, time, etc., into alcohol-related control policies, you're much better to focus on affordability, availability, and marketing, as opposed to educational initiatives. And what the alcohol industry often does is say, oh, we're going to put all this, corporate social responsibility money into alcohol-related educational campaigns, drink responsibly, etc. And that's their way of saying, look, we're spending all this money on, good things. We're educating the public, etc., etc. The evidence suggests that there is some modest benefit to educational campaigns, but it is certainly not the most effective strategies if your goal is to curb alcohol harm, and it's certainly not where you get most bang for your buck.
And ultimately, it is a question of money, isn't it?
It's a question of investment, yeah, but it's also a question of what's politically viable, and what your end goal is. If your end goal is to maximize your shareholder profits, you're going to put money into things that don't reduce the overall consumption of alcohol. If your end goal is public health, then you're hopefully going to use the best evidence at your availability and funnel your resources towards those interventions.
Where do you hope to sort of take your research next?
So what we're doing at the moment is quite exciting. So basically, there's two big data sets in the UK that hold a lot of information about drug and alcohol service provision. So and within Public Health England, there's what's called the National Drug Treatment Monitoring System, or NDTMS, and that basically takes data from all these 151 local authorities and looks at the sort of national picture. So who's coming into treatment, what kind of treatments they're receiving, etc. And then there's also a big database that captures information on people going to hospital, so which is called HES, or Hospital Episode Statistics. So basically, if you ever went into to hospital, it would say, male X years old, went in with a broken bone, stayed for 2 days, came out, we discharged him to his GP, that kind of thing. And what we're trying to do at the moment is link those two databases. So we've just done it actually, but and then what we'll be able to do is see on an individual level what kind of treatments have an impact on people going to hospital.
Okay.
Over time. So, the database goes back down to 1997. So we'll be able to sort of say, well, this person was in treatment for X number of years, they received these interventions for their alcohol, they ended up this much better. And we can look at how that impacts then on their individual rates of hospitalization, and do that both for individuals, but also for areas across the country over time.
That sounds like a really, really fascinating piece of work, because I guess it would really help shape you. I mean, as doctors, it would help guide you guys in terms of like knowing what works and what doesn't.
That's the plan. But we'll see. I mean, the other, yeah, we'll see what happens.
Where can people find you online?
I work at King's College London, KCL, so they can get in touch with me at emmert.roberts@kcl.ac.uk at my email, and I've got my profile page. If you just Google my name, Emmert Roberts, and KCL, they can find me there.
Are you on Twitter by any chance?
Not, no.
Okay. So well, I'll link these the profile onto the episode so people can get direct access to it. Just finally, what word of advice would you give to anyone hoping to get into this same line of work that you're currently pursuing?
So I suppose my main piece of advice is just to ask everyone and talk to everyone. People always get a bit, sort of scared of professors and, people in positions of power within universities, or consultants and doctors who are, may come across as intimidating. My experience of that is that, dropping anyone an email, they can only say no, and most of them, the vast majority of them, say, yeah, of course, come, let's have a coffee, or times let's meet over Zoom or Teams or whatever. There should be relatively few barriers to contacting senior academics and hospital consultants, most of whom are very happy to spend sort of 20-25 minutes chatting to you about career options and how they got where they are, pitfalls, etc.
No, I think that's fantastic advice. I think it's just it's something irrespective of the line of work or the discipline. This is something that people should be more encouraged to do. Unfortunately, academics happen to be extremely overworked at the moment. But fingers crossed things will change. Emma, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I'm really pleased to have you on the show, and hopefully once you've made some progress on the new research, we can invite you back on.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.